Recording, very good. So welcome to Shiur number 2 out of who knows how many. We seem to have lost a few on the way so far. We've frightened a few off by the looks of it. But we are not interested in quantity, it's quality that matters. Now that I've done a quick change from Menachem Begin back to myself, and change the background, we can continue on our journey through some Shemita halachot. So before I carry on where we left off, I just want to make a clarification, because apparently, according to my wife and one other person at least, when Vivian asked me a question, I didn't make my answer completely clear. So I just want to clarify a point that we discussed in the questions last week. The question that Vivian Simonoff asked was, what about a pot which is got a hole in it and is on the mirpeset? And I said that in order for it to be okay, then the pot has to be not have a hole in it, and it also has to be indoors. That means it has to have a roof over it, so like a greenhouse or inside the house. If a pot plant is in a pot she'eino nakuv, which is not got a hole in it, and it is inside, that is fine. And I thought that I had made it clear that that was talking about planting it in the first place. So if you want to plant a plant in a plant pot, it needs to be an unholed plant pot, and it needs to be indoors. However, if your plant is already in the plant pot before Shemitah, and it has a hole in it, or it is not got a covering, you are allowed to look after that plant. I did not mean to imply, and I don't think I made it entirely clear, that you don't have to take those plants and put them inside or take them out of the pot and throw them away or anything like that. I was talking about planting a plant lechatchila in the first place during Shemitah. The only way you can do that is in an unholed pot inside. But those plants that are already in existence before Shemitah in any kind of pot, you are allowed to keep them going. You're allowed to water them. You're allowed to do whatever is necessary to preserve them. What you can't do is stuff to improve them. So you can't give them that little bit of bio feed stuff that, that used to come in that little bottle with a little bulbous thing at the bottom that was meant to improve your plants. If it works, then you can't use it. If it doesn't work, then you can, but there isn't much point in using it if it doesn't work. So yes, you can water it. Yes, you can look after it, but you can't do anything to improve it. What you can't do is during the Shemitah year, if your plant is looking pot bound, in other words, you need to repot it into a bigger pot, that you can't do unless you pot it inside in an unholed plant pot. So, having clarified that, is that clear to everybody? Has anybody got any questions about that? Let me ask you, Vivian, I'm just interested for my own interest, really. Is that what you understood that I'd said in the first place? Or did you think that so I didn't make myself clear? Fine. Okay.
You may remember I was not very happy.
Yeah, I saw that. So
now, so thank you.
Okay, so you have Elisheva and Ella to thank for that, because they pointed out to me that I hadn't made myself clear. So, okay, so that is now clear. Whatever you have, you can look after. Whatever you haven't got, you can't do unless it falls into those two categories that we talked about. Okay, having said that, let's move on. But before we move on, let's just summarize very quickly what we did last week so that we can build on that. I'm going to share the screen with you. Those of you who've got the handout, it's the same handout that we had from last week, but I'm going to share the screen with you anyway, so that those of you who don't have it are not disadvantaged. Can you see the screen okay? Yeah. Okay, so you will remember that we had two major sources for the halachot of Shemitah. The main source, and certainly the sources of the negative commandments, in other words, the prohibitions during Shemitah, come from the Sedra of Bahar in the book of Vayikra, and they are on the screen here. So when you come to the land, you have a rest. You may sow your field for 6 years. You may prune your vineyard. You may gather its produce. In the 7th year shall be a complete rest. You shall not sow your field, nor shall you prune your vineyard. You shall not reap the aftergrowth. Sefiach ketzircha. We're going to come back to Sefiach, aftergrowth, shortly. You shall not pick your grapes. Remember, we spoke about this idea of there being different words in Hebrew for different activities of picking and harvesting. And so from there, we had the 4 main forbidden activities, which I have summarized over there on that page, page 3: sowing, pruning, reaping, and picking. If we go back to the Psukim, the same section, the next verse gives us, according to some opinions, not all opinions, a positive commandment of actually eating Shemitah produce. V'ayta Shabbat haaretz lachem le'ochla, to eat it, for you, for your servant, your female servant, your hired worker, your resident dweller who is with you, and even for the animals in the fields and in the land. All of this food, all of this produce should be le'echol, to eat. So that is the source of the prohibitions and one of the positive commandments. The next source, or actually really the first source, but I've put it second here because the main source is the one we've just done. The second source is in the book of Shemot, and it is chapter 23. And here we have this word. This is where the word Shemitah comes from. That 6 years you may sow your land and gather the produce. V'hashviyit, in the 7th year, tishmetena unatashta. You can see the word Shemitah in the middle of that word, tishmetena. Those of you who haven't got it, you can see it on the screen there. Shin mem tet nun Shemitah. Shemitah. That is the origin of the word. You shall translate it here. You shall release it. Unatashta. You shall, and that's a sort of a super tishmetena. That's abandon it completely. And from here, from these two words, we learn the positive commandment, going back to page 3 over here, of being mafkir, to make the Shemitah produce ownerless. So you are mafkir, you make it hefker, you abandon ownership of the produce. So that is the origin of the mitzvah there. And in the second pasuk of our first/second source, we have again the idea of v'achlu evyonei amecha, the poor people shall eat of it, and what they leave over, the animals can eat. And the same goes for your vineyard and your olive trees. So those are the sources. And last week we spoke in detail about the idea of sowing and planting. which is how we came to speak about Vivian's pot plants. We also spoke a little bit about pruning, and I'm going to speak a bit more about pruning now. And we also spoke a little bit about these things down here, the forbidden activities from the rabbis, and we're going to come back to that because they are connected to the 4 main categories. We also spoke a little bit about hefker and le'ochla, and again we will come back to that in more detail later on. So that's more or less, I think, that what we covered last week, and I'm going to take you down the pages now to page 6, and I want to talk a little bit of detail about the idea of zamira, which is translated as pruning, but it's a little bit more sophisticated than what I understand anyway to be pruning. As you can see from Rav Rimon's little box here, the word zamira is related to the word zamora, which is the branch of a grapevine, and specifically the branch of a grapevine. And the idea of pruning involves cutting things back in order to promote growth. And as it says here, pruning requires professional skill and judgment. How do you know what to do? If you ask me to come and prune your trees, I'll probably make a big mess of it. I'll probably cut off the wrong bits and not cut off the bits that I should, because I don't know what I'm doing. It's a professional skill. And the more professional you are, the better results you'll get, which is why you have people who are supposedly have green fingers. That means that they're experienced, they know what they're doing, and they do it properly. So, what is the idea of pruning? So, the idea of pruning is to improve what you already have. In the case of a grapevine, pruning is understood today as a means of limiting the number of grape clusters that the vine will produce in the following season. And if not, what will happen is you'll get little shoots coming everywhere and you'll get lots of grapes. So you'll say to me, well, that's all right, that's good, isn't it? Why would you want to limit the number of grapes that you have on your grapevine? Well, the answer to that is because if you don't do that, you get lots of grapes, but they're all a bit schwach. They're all a bit measly and not very strong, and you get lots of poor quality grapes. And the idea of pruning of a grapevine, apparently, is that you should have a smaller number, but better quality of grape. So the idea of pruning is to improve the grapevine and the fruit that comes of it. So because pruning is in the category of forbidden activities, it is called a zamira, and it's in that category because the pasuk says, here we go, shesh shanim tizmor karmecha, 6 years you shall do this activity called zamira, pruning. Next verse, uvashana shviit, sadacha lo tizra, your field you will not sow, v'karmecha lo tizmor, you can't do this pruning. So that is one of the 4 categories here, which brings us to all of these things here, because the rabbis say that if pruning is forbidden, it's forbidden for a particular reason. It's forbidden because you are improving the fruit, and the idea is that you should leave it completely alone to do its own thing. So therefore, anything else that you do which results in the same outcome, which is to improve the product, to improve the fruit, cannot be done. It's not allowed. And therefore, we say all these activities, watering, weeding, fertilizing, cutting, and spraying with pesticides are not allowed. What we said last week, and I want to reiterate that now, is that these forbidden activities are not forbidden completely, because if you don't water your plants, they will die. And you are not meant to leave your plants to die. You're meant to preserve your plants, your trees, your seedlings, whatever it is. You're not meant to improve them. So you give them just enough water so that they will live and that they will be preserved. Same for weeding. You remember we talked about the bougainvillea that strangled my mango tree. Well, if you have weeds that are going to strangle your plants or trees and kill them, then you're allowed to take the weeds out. What you're not allowed to do is to take the weeds out so that your own plants will improve, so that the weeds don't take the nutrients from the land away from your plants that you want. Same for fertilizer. If your plant is so schwach that it's going to die unless you give it fertilizer, then you can give it fertilizer. But if you just want it to be improved and without the fertilizer it will live, then you can't. You get the idea. Cutting is the same as pruning in a way. For lawns, the idea is that if you cut a lawn just to be pretty and look nice so you've got the stripes, that's okay. But if you've got a bit of a schwach lawn and you want to cut it nice and short so that you promote growth, then you can't do that. Same with the pesticides. So we can see from the from this idea of pruning, let's have a look at Rav Rimon's chart here, because like everything else in Shemitah, we have a machloket as to what this refers to. The pasuk itself refers to grapevines. Karmecha lo tizmor. Your grapevine you shall not prune. Doesn't say anything about grapefruits or lemons or mangoes or any other kind of fruit. It only speaks about the grapevine. And in Shemot, it says the olives as well. So the question is asked by the rabbis, does the isur, the prohibition on improving your plants and trees, apply only to grapevines, or does it apply to all fruit trees, or all trees even, or all plants even? And this depends on who you go by, of course. So the let's take the strictest view altogether is the Rambam Maimonides. He says that the pasuk says whether a grapevine or any other tree. Let's look at the pasuk itself. Where is it? Oh, where have I gone? Okay, so here it is. You shall do it to your grapevine or your olive trees, and that, according to the Rambam Maimonides, let's go back to it. He says that means the pruning of all trees is asur midoraita, from the Torah. So according to the Rambam, it's a Torah prohibition, all of those things. Rashi, and surprisingly the Chazon Ish, who normally takes the most machmir position, take a more lenient position and say that the pruning of grapevines is a Torah law, but the pruning of all other trees or the improvement of all other plants is derabanan, is a rabbinic law. Rav Kook says that agrees with this opinion, with the Rashi's opinion, and says that there's a fundamental difference between grapevines and other trees, and therefore, because the pruning promotes the growth of new fruit on the pruned branches itself, because apparently where the buds are, that's where it comes. And therefore, according to Rav Kook, apparently, a kiwi tree would be forbidden deoraita because it also falls into the same category of the type of tree that pruning would improve in that particular way. We paskin, generally speaking, like Rashi and the Chazon Ish, which means that pruning and improving a grapevine would be an Issa Deoraita, a Torah law, and all other trees, apart from a kiwi, would be a rabbinic law. So all of these things that we have over here, these things here apply Derabanan to other trees and Deoraita to grapevines. So that means that in our gardens, we have a Derabanan that we can't do these things. Now, as you know, in the case of need, we are machmir, we take the stricter view if it's a Deoraita, if it's a Torah law, and we are mekil, we take the more lenient view if it is a Derabanan. So if, for example, you had some kind of doubt about whether a watering situation or a weeding situation or a fertilizing situation or a cutting situation was Derabanan or was either improving or preserving, if we were talking about a grapevine, we would err on the side of caution and would not allow it. And if we were talking about a non-grapevine, we would err on the side of leniency. It's not really a right statement to err on the side of leniency, but we would lean towards leniency. And the example there would be cutting a lawn. This is a good example of what I'm talking about. Because when you cut a lawn, generally speaking, as we said before, if you have a nice healthy lawn, then you're cutting it to make it look nice, because it doesn't look nice if it's all straggly and long. But it also, at the same time, does promote growth, especially if you cut it short. Now, because we paskin like the Chazon Ish and Rashi, that grapevines alone are deoraita, it would be allowed for us to cut the lawn in the normal way, as long as we were not doing it specifically to promote growth. So in other words, if we were doing it largely and mainly to make it look nice, and as a bit of a side effect, it promoted growth, then we would have what to rely on in that opinion. Now, if, however, we had a similar situation with a grapevine, and there was a chance that what we were doing would improve the grapevine, we would have to be very, very careful and try very hard not to do that, because that's a deoraita and we have to be more strict about it. That is the point of knowing which one it is, whether it's a deoraita or drabanan, because at the end of the day, they're both forbidden. It's a question of the situation of doubt, how we actually behave in the situation of doubt. Okay, now let's move on to the positive commandments of Shemitah, because I want to get to that in some detail today and then carry on next time. So let's just move down to here. Now, harvesting and gathering was number 3 and 4 in the forbidden list. Pretty obvious what harvesting and gathering means. It means that you can't pick the fruit and the vegetables. But we know, don't we, that you can pick them and you can harvest them. How do we know that? Because, as we've just said, we have a positive commandment. La'ochla, they're meant to be eaten. Now this, for the chutzniks, is a little bit of a chidush because we're not used to that. We're not used in Chutz La'aretz to the concept of eating Shemitah produce, because the Israeli produce in our shops in Chutz La'aretz is, on the whole, going to be produce which was grown not in accordance with Shemitah rules, and therefore we can't eat it. So for when you're in Chutz La'aretz, all you can really do is avoid it, because unless you know that that produce has been grown in accordance with Shemitah, which perchance you might find in an Israeli produce somewhere. You might find on the label a hechsher that says that this has been grown in accordance with Shemitah, but the chances are pretty slim in Chutz La'aretz, because that would make the stuff difficult to commercially sell, as we will see. But in Eretz Yisrael, we do have the opportunity to eat it, and we can eat it. In order to eat it, we have to harvest it or gather it. So when the Torah tells us you can't harvest it or gather it, it clearly doesn't mean you can't harvest it or gather it at all, because then if you didn't, you won't be able to eat it unless you, as we said last week, got on all fours and ate it like a dog on the ground, and you can't do that. So what does it mean when it says lo tiktzor et invein zirecha, do not gather, do not et invein zirecha lo tiktzor, don't pick your grapes? What does it mean? It means that you don't do it in a way which is commercially working the produce. So you are allowed to harvest your produce. You are allowed to pick your fruit and your vegetables for your own use, for your family's use, and even for other people. But what you can't do is commercially work with it. In other words, you can't sell it, because that would be against the halakha. And we'll see how this works in a moment. At the bottom of this page, you will see. Okay, so we need to understand this concept of Shamur. We said earlier on that it is a positive commandment to be mafkir the field, to render the field ownerless, to tishmatena unatashta, to abandon the field and make it ownerless. Once it's ownerless, it's called hefker. If it's not been made hefker, then it is called shamur, from the word shomer. You all know what the word shomer means. Shomer means to guard. Shomer Shabbat. Shomer Torah u'mitzvot, to keep something, to guard it. Those of you who've been in the army or have had children or grandchildren in the army will know that what they hate doing most is shmirah, guard duty. Okay, so shamur is the I can't remember what the grammatical expression is of it, but it is the it means guarded. It is the field is called shamur, and once that has not been made hefker, then you can't harvest that fruit because it's not been made hefker. Okay, so what are you going to do with that? Rashi will tell us in a minute what you can do that. Second idea is that you have a hefker field. You've correctly made the field ownerless, but it is permitted to gather and harvest, but only in a way which is not the normal way to harvest. In other words, you do it with a shinui. Many of you will know that word shinui from the halachot of Shabbat. That if you need to do something on Shabbat for a specific need which you're not meant to do, say, switch on a light for somebody who's not well, then the best way to do it is with a shinui, to do it in an unusual manner. So with that example, you would do it with your elbow. You put the switch on with your elbow because you don't normally do it with your elbow. You do it with your finger. That's called doing something with a shinui in an unusual manner. So again, we have a machloket between the various opinions as to what you can do and what you can't do. Rabbeinu Tam, who you will have heard of because he is famous for his timings when it comes to Shabbat and Chag. Rabbeinu Tam's time, any of you who have been in Laniado Hospital over Shabbat will know, as I found out to my cost, that you cannot get your mobile phone out as soon as you think Shabbat is out, because they keep Rabbeinu Tam's time, which is another half an hour or so. And if you do get your phone out, you will have the shomer, there's that word again, come and tell you on no uncertain terms to put it away, because they keep Rabbeinu Tam's time. Rabbeinu Tam was the grandson of Rashi, and he has an opinion on what you can do. And he says, produce which has not been declared ownerless, Shamur, you cannot harvest at all. You can't take it. You can't eat it. You can't take it. It just has to stay on the trees. But you can harvest from a field which is hefker, but only with a shinui. Okay, Rashi, Rabbeinu Tam's grandfather, is more lenient. And he says that if you have a field which is hefker, then you can harvest in a normal manner. You don't need to use a shinui. You don't need to do it in an unusual way. And we'll talk about what means an unusual way in a minute. You can do it normally. A Shamur field, one which was not made ownerless, you can only harvest with a shinui. That's according to Rashi. Ramban has a different opinion, a mixture of the two, and then Rambam has a different opinion and says they both need a shinui. So there's a little summary for those of you who've got the handout. You can look at that at your leisure. I'm not going to go into that in any more detail. But what I am going to do now is ask the question and show you what it means to do something with a shinui, to do it in a different way. Depending on which opinion you take, you may or may not be able to harvest your produce with a shinui. If I said to you, what does that mean? You have to know what it means. I explained to you just now what it means with switching on the light on Shabbat. It means doing it with your elbow or your forehead or whatever in an unusual manner. So what constitutes a shinui when it comes to harvesting your fruit or produce? And we learn this from a Mishnah. And the Mishnah says, I'll read it in English. Sabbatical figs. What does that mean? That means figs that come from Shmita may not be cut in the muktzah. We'll come back to that in a minute. But he may cut them in an open place. Grapes may not be trodden in the wine press, but they may be trodden in a kneading trough. Olives may not be prepared in an olive press or in a small olive press, but he may crush them and bring them into a small olive press in the field. Rabbi Shimon says they may even be crushed in the larger olive press, and then he brings them into the smaller press. So what this Mishnah is teaching us, by the way, the muktzah is nothing to do with what we say muktzah on Shabbos. The muktzah is a special place where, like grapes are trodden in a wine press and olives are prepared in an olive press, figs are cut in this particular place, in this particular thing called a muktzah. I'm not quite sure what it is, but it's a specific tool or place used for figs. So these opinions are that the shinui is that the tool you use is different. So this Mishnah, for example, let's use grapes. That's obvious here. You would normally use a wine press to press your grapes. Not what I was always told. I think Jeffrey Glasky was guilty of telling me this when I was a kid, that actually when the people that make grapes take their shoes and socks off and tread all over the grapes. And I don't think I drunk wine for ages after that, or grape juice, because I didn't fancy drinking stuff that people had trodden all over. And he used to tease me about those things. But grapes are made in a wine press. It's a specific tool used for pressing wine, for making grapes. So according to these opinions, the Rosh, the Bartanura, and Tosfot, you have to use a different tool. And that's what the Mishnah is teaching us. You can't use this specific wine press for grapes, but you can take it into a kneading trough and you can press the grapes in a kneading trough or some other kind of receptacle that you would not usually use for treading grapes, for pressing grapes. Same for an olives, which are normally made pressed in an olive press. You can do it in something else. And the idea being that you're using a different tool. By the way, we learn a similar idea. Somebody, in fact, this very day asked me a Shabbat question, a Shabbat shaila. What was the shaila? The shaila is, can you peel carrots on Shabbat morning for your salad on Shabbat lunchtime? And the answer is yes, you can, but you should not use a vegetable peeler because that is a specific tool used for that purpose. If you need to peel your carrots on a Shabbos morning for your salad at Shabbos lunch, then you can do so using a knife or using some other receptacle, some other tool that you would not usually use for that. It's a shinui. It's a difference from the word leshanot, to change. You'll recognize that word, by the way, from Pesach. What do we say on Pesach night? What do the little children say? Ma nishtana. Ma nishtana halayla hazeh. What is different about this night? Nishtana is the form of the word for the night. Ma nishtana. What is different about the word? You can see it's the same root, shinui, and nishtana. Ma nishtana is the same root of the word. So according to the Rosh, Bartanura, and Tosfot, the difference is the tool that should be used. According to Rambam, and this is where we paskin, we actually paskin like both, but according to the Rambam, it's the quantity that is relevant, that makes it different. Normally in your field, you would gather in all your produce at once and you would sell it. According to the Rambam, the shinui, the change that you have to make is that you can't bring in all the harvest at once. You have to bring in a little bit at a time. As it says here in the box, in practice, it's preferable to effect a shinui in both things, in the act of harvest itself, in other words, to do it in a different way, and also in the amount that's harvested. So in a situation where it's difficult to do that, in other words, you haven't got any other way of harvesting it except with the normal harvesting tool, then you can use that, but you must make a change in the quantity that you harvest. So that is the halachot of shinui, and that is relevant to a field or an area of place where there's produce, which is Shamur. The owners failed to abandon it, failed to make it hefker, failed to render it ownerless. Now, there is a parallel situation. The situation with Shamur is a b'diavad situation. In other words, what I mean by that, it's not ideal to have a situation where the owner failed to make it ownerless. Really, he should have made it ownerless. Only we're asking, what should we do in the situation where he failed to do that? So now we have a similar sort of question. And this is called ne'evad. Ne'evad, from the word oved. You all know what the word oved means. It means to work. An eved is a servant. If something oved, it works. Okay, when you give your credit card to the cashier and it doesn't go through, he or she may say, Ze lo oved, it doesn't work. It's the same word, ne'evad. This is produce from a field that was worked illegally against the halakha. So in other words, you went ahead and you planted stuff in Shemitah, or you went ahead and you fertilized stuff on during Shemitah, and you improved the produce and you grew the produce all illegally. What are you going to do with that produce? What can be done with it? What should be done with it? We're in the similar situation to Shamur in that you shouldn't have done this in the first place. This field should not have been worked, but now that it has been worked illegally, we've got to deal with the consequences and know what can be done. And again, we rely on a Mishnah. The Mishnah in Trumot speaks like this. Hamatbil kelim b'Shabbat. Somebody who immerses a vessel, toivels, as we would say in French. Somebody who toivels a vessel on Shabbat, which you're not allowed to do. Okay? But you do it shogeg, by mistake. What does that mean? That means either you forgot it was Shabbos and you did it, and then afterwards you remembered it was Shabbat, or you did not know the halakha that you weren't allowed to do this on Shabbat. Had you known either that it was Shabbat or that it wasn't allowed, you wouldn't have done it. But you did it because you didn't know. That's called shogeg. Says the Mishnah, yishtamesh bahem. You are allowed to use those kelim. Why? Because even though you did something illegal, you immersed this vessel illegally, as it were, on Shabbat. It was done in good faith, by mistake, and therefore the Mishnah allows you to use them. However, mezid, if you did it deliberately, in other words, I know it's Shabbat, I know I'm not allowed to do it, and I'm doing it anyway, and you do it. That's called mezid, on purpose. Says the Mishnah, lo yishtamesh bahem, you can't use it. Next case, hamaaser v'hamavshil b'Shabbat. Somebody who separates maaser, takes their tithes on Shabbat, which you're not allowed to do, or somebody who cooks. You can see the word bishul here, can you? Mavshil. Somebody who cooks. Somebody who does cooking on Shabbat. Well, you all know you can't cook on Shabbat. Shogeg, if you do it by mistake, same idea. Either you forgot it was Shabbat, you thought it was Sunday, or for some reason or other, you didn't know you weren't allowed to do that act. Yochal, you're allowed to eat the food. Mezid, if you did it on purpose, lo yochal, you're not allowed to eat it. Hanotea b'Shabbat, somebody who plants something on Shabbat. which is not allowed. Shogeg yikayem. If you did it by accident, you forgot it was Shabbat, or you didn't know you weren't allowed, you do not have to uproot it. You can leave it. But if you did it on purpose, ya'akor, you have to uproot it. Now we come at the end of the Mishnah to our situation. Uvashviit, and in the 7th year during Shemitah, ben shogeg ben mezid ya'akor. If you planted in Shemitah year, either by mistake or deliberately, unlike all the other examples in the Mishnah, you have to uproot those plants. You can't leave them be. That's what the Mishnah says. From here, the Ramban, Nachmanides, he holds from this Mishnah, he reads very clearly, simple pshat, simple explanation of the Mishnah. Any Shemitah produce that grew as a result of a violation of the prohibitions of Shemitah, you cannot eat it at all. There's nothing you can do with it. So that, of course, is the source for us in Chutz La'aretz not buying our Israeli produce, because we don't know whether it was grown in Shemitah or not. And even if you say, well, the majority of Israeli growers would have grown it by mistake because they wouldn't know the halachot of Shemitah, because they haven't been to the Techelet course. So they have no idea that they're doing wrong. And so you may then say, well, okay, in that case, I can eat it. Says Ramban, no, look at our Mishnah. Our Mishnah says, ben shogeg, ben mezid, makes no difference. Either planted unwittingly or intentionally, he must unroot it. According to Ramban, the Ramban's interpretation of the Mishnah, which is the simple interpretation, no, can do, cannot eat it. Rambam, Maimonides, confusing, isn't it? Rambam, Maimonides holds the opposite. He says that this Mishnah only applies to Sefichim, which is translated as aftergrowth. And I'm going to come back to that, not this week now, but next week. And he says that Shemitah produce that grew as a result of a violation of the prohibitions of Shemitah may be eaten. And that this idea of planting in Shemitah, you have to uproot it and therefore can't eat it, does not apply to Shemitah produce in the whole, only in Sefichim, which are, b'kitzur, in short, vegetables and things which grow on their own, which we will come back to. The contemporary poskim, such as Reb Shlomo Zalman Auerbach, and even the Chazon Ish, are lenient on this issue. So you will say to me, well, in that case, why do we in Chutz La'aretz have to avoid the stuff in the shops? Well, theoretically, according to the Reb Shlomo Zalman Auerbach and Chazon Ish, then you could be lenient and you could eat it. But that's really a b'diavad, because you have options. If you had no option and there was no other food in the shops other than that food which was a bit dodgy, then you could be lenient. But given that these days you have a choice of Israeli oranges, Spanish oranges, American oranges, or wherever, you don't have to choose the things that do have a doubt about them. So that is why, even though there are opinions that are lenient on this, they don't recommend lechatchila in the first instance to rely on that leniency. Now, let's talk about this idea of Sefichim, because it's important. Let's go, I've quoted here this Pasuk 5, but I want to take you back to the whole thing in context. So I'm going to whiz you to the top of the page. Here is our source in Bahar, in Vayikra. You may sow your field for 6 years, and 6 years you prune your vineyard and gather its produce. But in the 7th year, the land shall have a complete rest, a Sabbath to the Lord. You shall not sow your field, you shall not prune your vineyard. You shall not reap the aftergrowth of your harvest. Et Sefiach ketzircha, Sefiach, which is the singular of Sefichim. You shall not reap the aftergrowth. That's the pasuk that we're talking about. Now, what does that mean? Let's go back down the page now. Here we go. Sefichim is produce that grows by itself. Now, we've got one of Rabbi Rimon's boxes here to help us. The prohibition of Sefichim, it looks to be a Torah law, because the verse says very clearly, Et Sefiach ketzircha lo tiktor. The aftergrowth of your harvest you shall not reap, you shall not harvest. So Rabbi Akiva, the great Rabbi Akiva, one of the greatest sages of the Tanaic period, is very clear. And he says that this is a Torah law. The Chachamim say that it's only a rabbinic decree. And why is it a rabbinic decree? Because what it's there for is for tree Jews, basically. We Jews have a history of being tricksters. We go back a long way being tricksters. And what the rabbis are worried about is that if we say it is forbidden to plant your vegetable seeds during Shemitah, so you can't plant your tomato plants, let's say, and I want to have tomato plants, but I don't want you to think that I've broken Shemitah. So what do? I plant my tomato plants covertly in the middle of the night when you're not watching. And I say, when they start to grow, oh, look at this. It grew all on its own. I never had anything to do with it. I didn't plant it. It just came out of its own. Now, you're going to say, well, that's a bit far-fetched, isn't it? Absolutely not. Because I used the example of tomatoes deliberately because I am a very knowledgeable person about tomatoes, because my wife grows tomatoes in industrial quantities. And why do we have industrial quantity tomato in our garden? Because they are growing everywhere. Because my wife has compost, and all the old bits of rubbish food go into the compost heap. And when she feeds the compost onto the flowers, there are tomato pips in there. And lo and behold, the tomato plant grows on its own without having been planted there. And if you come around our garden, you will see tomatoes growing everywhere, out of everything. We've even got them in the hanging baskets, because the compost that was mixed with the soil had bits of old tomato in it. So I could surreptitiously, if I was that way inclined, during Shemitah, surreptitiously plant a plant and then claim that it was planted, I didn't plant it and it just came on its own. So in order to prevent that, in order to prevent the temptation to a tricky person to break the Shemitah law, the rabbis said, even stuff that grows on its own, you can't eat. So it's not going to help you, Lieberman, if you try and do a trick and plant it surreptitiously and then claim it grew on its own. Because even if it grew on its own, You can't have it. So it's not going to help you. And that is actually the halacha. The halacha is that it is a derabanan, that sfiach, meaning things that grow on their own, you cannot eat during Shemitah. And here's a nice little box here, takes you down this left-hand side of the page here. So by rabbinic decree, a person cannot eat stuff that grew on its own in case a person plants covertly and claim it grew on its own. So therefore, vegetables planted during the Shemitah year, you cannot eat because you're not allowed to plant. We know that, don't we? That's zariah, that's sowing. Plants that grew on their own, you're going to say to me, I never planted it. Well, you still can't eat it because I'm worried that little tricksters might pretend that they have not planted it and therefore would do it surreptitiously. So plants that grow on their own, not allowed. Now, what about vegetables that grew during the 6th year but were picked in the 7th year? So it's Rosh Hashanah comes and it becomes Shemitah, and you have on your tomato plants lots of tomatoes or peppers or whatever else it is ready to be picked as the Shemitah year begins. So does that count as Shemitah produce or not? And again, like all good Jewish things, we have a machloket. The Rambam is consistent and takes the strict view and says that is forbidden. And the reason that the Rambam says it's forbidden is because, again, it's the yellow line on the platform, because if you pick vegetables that grew in the 6th year, you're going to make a mistake and pick vegetables that grew a couple of months later, because you're going to say, well, I picked them in September, so why can't I pick them in October, November, December? Rashi and the other Rishonim say that we don't worry about that. If it grew in the 6th year, you can pick it in the 7th year. That is what the halacha is. And the reason for that is because it is a safek. It's a doubt. It's a leniency in a rabbinic law. Go to the top of this and you see it's rabbinic law. According to Rabbi Akiva, if we went according to Rabbi Akiva, if there was a doubt, we would have to be machmir, we would have to be strict, because Rabbi Akiva says it's not a rabbinic law, it's a Torah law. So we've come to the end of this handout, because we have now come to the end of part 1. Part 1 was the sources for the mitzvot, both positive and negative mitzvot of Shemitah, which we spoke about with these psukim. It was the categorization of the forbidden activities and the positive commandments of Shemitah, to eat it, and the Kedushat Shvi'it we haven't yet got to, because that's the next category we're going to go into. And we've learnt how not to break Shemitah in terms of planting, in terms of pots inside the house with holes in them, pruning, and the concept we've learnt today, the important concepts of what does it mean to harvest, what is Shamur. We've learnt that is a field that was not made hefker, not made ownerless. We learnt the concept of ne'evad, of a field that was worked illegally. And we also learnt the concept of what is a shinui, how to make a harvest with a difference. In other words, so that you recognize the difference between the way you harvest in Shemitah and the way you harvest outside of Shemitah. Now, most of that lot will not apply to us because we're not farmers. Some of it will apply to us because we have vegetable patches or fruit trees in our gardens. But most of it will not apply to us because we're not plowing and all that kind of stuff. what I want to talk about next week, and there will be a new handout for that, is how we behave in our kitchens. In other words, if we do have Shemitah produce, in other words, we have our garden fruit, we were mafkir our garden, we made our gardens ownerless, and we have trees or we have vegetables. Vegetables a bit more difficult. Let's talk about trees. We have trees and we take the fruit off the trees, and it's Shemitah fruit. That fruit has kedusha, it has holiness, because it has been grown according to halacha in the holy land, in the holy year of Shemitah. So therefore, that fruit has to be dealt with in a different way to all other types of produce, other type, or the same fruit in a different year, which does not have kedusha. There are certain things that we mustn't do with it because it has holiness. Something that's holy has to be treated in a respectful way. So what I'm going to go through with you next week is the way we must behave with our produce, which is Shemitah, holy produce. And that will be next week. And the final week, I hope will be the final week, will be the practicalities of shopping. Okay, really, I should do shopping before the Shemitah produce, but you'll understand the shopping bit better if I do the Kedusha section first, because the Kedusha section only actually applies to produce which is proper Shemitah, and you'll see from when I do the shopping bit that not all of it is. So really, I should do shopping before Kedusha, but I'm not going to, and it all will be revealed at the end, as you'll see why. Hopefully it makes more sense. So for last week and this week, we've actually built our knowledge. We've built up our knowledge of where the Shemitah halachot come from and what they actually are in terms of the way fruits and vegetables are grown and harvested. And next week, we'll talk about how to deal with them once they get into our kitchens. So I'm going to stop there, and I'm going to open up to questions. Avril, if you would keep the recording going for the questions, please, because often the questions are more relevant even than what I've said, as we found out last week from Vivian's question. So any questions on what we've learned so far, either this week or last week? Either put your hand up, or if you can't manage to do that, then you can shout out. Any questions? Okay.
There's a couple of things in the chat box you might want to look at.
Oh, are they? Right. Thank you. Let me have a look at the chat box then. Let me stop sharing and go to the chat box. Okay, let me read out the chats that are relevant. So, isn't pruning prevention of deterioration rather than improving? Again, if without pruning your tree or bush would die, then yes, it is. But if your tree or bush would not die and your pruning makes it healthier, and that is the reason for your pruning, then that would not be allowed. So I think it depends on the individual situation that you're dealing with in terms of the pruning and how and what your intention is and what would happen if you didn't prune. I think that's the key aspect here is if you didn't do this activity you're about to do, what would happen to your plant?
Yeah, but you're talking about dying. I'm talking about deteriorating. It's not necessarily dying. It just means being not as good as it was before Shemitah.
Okay, I definitely understand the distinction between those two, and I guess there would be, and again, I suppose it's a matter of degree. If it would deteriorate to the point where it's very unwell, then for sure you would be allowed to do it. If it just would not be quite as good, but is still strong and reasonably healthy, then probably you wouldn't. So I think you probably have to use a bit of discretion in that regard. But the point that you make is correct, Paul, and that is if it's going to deteriorate, let's use the word significantly, and I know that's subjective, but everybody's going to have to make their own judgment, I guess. If it's going to deteriorate significantly without it, then yes, you can do it. I agree with that. Okay, the next question is, there are places where you're not allowed to let the grass grow more than a certain height. If it is a drop higher, there is a fine. Are we then allowed to cut the grass? Yes, we are, because at that point, we will not be cutting the grass to make it grow more. We're cutting it not to have a fine. And as I understand it, it's only when you cut it short that you promote growth. If you cut it long, in other words, you cut it just below that which you're not allowed to do it higher than, according to all opinions, you will be permitted to cut that grass to that height with no problem at all. Binyan Poal, thank you very much. Thank you very much, Rachel, for that. I could not think of that word for the life of me. It just escaped me. Yes. It was obviously non-kosher wine. Yes, it was. No doubt that was what Jeffrey was saying. I've seen photos of shoeless people stamping on grapes. Yes, I know, you told me that a long time ago, Jeffrey, and I believed you. If the produce is left in the field, it will rot. So what happens then? Okay, well, if the produce is left in the field and it rots, well, that's what happens to it. It's the same thing that happens if you don't harvest it in a normal year. If you're not allowed to harvest it for the reasons that we've said, if you take the stricter view or whatever the scenario is, you don't do it with a shinu and you have to leave it on, well, that's what will happen to it. It will rot. You are personally not treating it with a lack of kedusha, as we'll see next week. Hang on to that question for next week. Would it be possible to receive the last 2 sheets, please? Yes, the handout will be sent out again on the Techelet email and the Techelet WhatsApp group. If anybody is not on the WhatsApp group or the email group and would like to be on it to get all the shiurim and the notifications, please send a note of your email address or WhatsApp contact details to Avril, and she will add you to the group with pleasure. Ella says, what if I want to use a pesticide for my plant, which will be good only for 4 months? Can I refresh the soil with another portion of pesticide after the 4 months? The plant will be very poor looking if I won't use the pesticide. I think that's a bit like Paul's question of pruning. I think, Ella, that depends on how bad it will be. You can only use the pesticide if not using the pesticide is going to result in significant deterioration of the plant. You're not expected to lose the plant or lose money because you have to replace the plant. If it's going to be really very poor, then you would be able to use it on the basis that you're only using it to get it to preserve it. So it'd be a question of quantity, I guess. You just use the absolute minimum that you have to just to get it right. Okay, so there's the number on chat to send the WhatsApp message to Avril if you want to be added to the groups. Have a look on chat and note that down. Charlie says, I have so much ignorance around plants that I don't know enough to know what I need to know to keep the plant alive rather than to make it grow. Maybe Elisheva should give a series of shiurim on plants. Very good suggestion. I'll ask her. Okay, any other questions before we go? Okay, in that case, we will stop the recording and we will get a copy of the recording and send it out on the groups. And